Nobody saw Mookie Betts coming. That was the part that made everything else harder to process. The Glasnow situation had been building for days. The Sasaki decision had its own visible pressure underneath it for weeks. Even the front office tension had a shape to it, something you could trace backward and find the origin of if you looked hard enough. But Mookie Betts criticizing Dave Roberts? That had no origin. That had no warning. That arrived the way the most significant things in baseball always arrive, without announcement, without precedent, in a moment so unexpected that the people in the room needed several seconds just to confirm that what they had heard was actually what had been said. Mookie Betts. The most professionally composed player in that clubhouse. The man who had spent years being the emotional anchor of a franchise that desperately needed one. The player who smiled in the right moments, stayed silent in the difficult ones, and never, not once in his entire time in Los Angeles, put his name next to a criticism of the people making decisions above him. He had just done exactly that. And now nothing in that clubhouse felt the same. Go back to the 8th inning first. Go back to the moment that started everything, because without that moment, none of what followed makes any sense. The Dodgers were ahead. Not comfortably ahead. The kind of ahead that feels like a single wrong decision away from becoming behind. The kind of lead that demands precision from a manager, from a pitching staff, from every person wearing a uniform making a decision in real time under the weight of a stadium full of people who expect things to go right. Roberts sent out Tanner Scott. It was not an unreasonable decision. On paper, in the abstract, in the quiet analytical space where baseball decisions look clean and logical and stripped of consequence, it was defensible. Scott had the arm. Scott had the profile for that moment. Scott had done it before. What Scott did not have, on that particular night, in that particular inning, was control of the strike zone. The at-bats were long. The pitch counts climbed faster than they should have. And then, in the sequence that the Dodgers front office would spend the next 12 hours dissecting from every available angle, Scott left a pitch in a location that pitchers spend their entire careers being taught never to leave a pitch. The go-ahead run scored. The stadium made a sound that stadiums make when something has gone wrong in a way that cannot immediately be undone. Not silence. Something worse than silence. The sound of 60,000 people absorbing a reality they had not prepared themselves for. And in the manager's box, Dave Roberts stood completely still. The GM did not wait. That was the detail that separated this response from the ordinary organizational adjustments that happen after difficult losses. Losing a lead in the 8th inning is painful. Losing a lead in the 8th inning because a trusted reliever couldn't execute a specific pitch in a specific moment is the kind of thing that gets discussed the next morning in a measured conversation about adjustments going forward. What happened instead was immediate. Before the final out of that game had been recorded, before the post-game press conferences had begun, before the players had finished processing what they had just experienced, the decision had already been made. Tanner Scott was being punished. Not optioned. Not quietly moved down the depth chart with the kind of organizational language designed to soften the reality of what was happening. Punished. The word that people inside the building kept using, privately, in the hours that followed, because no other word accurately described what the GM had decided. And the replacement they had chosen for the closer role was not who anyone expected. Roki Sasaki. Sit with that for a moment. Roki Sasaki, who had been at the center of organizational turbulence for weeks. Who had made tearful demands about whether the organization still believed in him. Who had been repositioned and restructured and asked to become different versions of himself in response to decisions that kept arriving faster than he could fully absorb them. Roki Sasaki was now being designated as the closer for the Los Angeles Dodgers. The urgency of the designation was what made it feel so different from a standard role reassignment. This wasn't the front office sitting down and carefully considering their options over several days. This was a decision made in the heat of what had just happened, driven by the specific anger of a GM who had watched a lead disappear in the 8th inning and decided that the structure that had allowed it to happen needed to change immediately. People inside the organization described the GM's mood that night as something they had not seen before. Not frustration. Not disappointment. Something harder than both of those things. The kind of mood that produces decisions that would ordinarily take weeks to arrive at in a matter of hours. And Sasaki, who had spent weeks asking whether anyone still believed in him, was now being handed the highest pressure role on the pitching staff. Whether that was belief or whether it was desperation was a question nobody in that building was prepared to answer honestly. Tanner Scott found out the way players always find out about these things. Through a conversation that is never as long as it should be. Through words that are chosen carefully but land hard regardless of how carefully they are chosen. Through the specific silence that follows those words when there is nothing left to say and both people in the room know it. What happened after that conversation was not what anyone expected from Tanner Scott. He had always been professional. Quiet in the way that relievers are often quiet, carrying the particular loneliness of a role that only gets noticed when something goes wrong, absorbing the weight of that without letting it show in the places where it could damage him. He let it show. The exact words traveled through the clubhouse the way things travel through clubhouses, faster than they should, with slightly different details depending on who was telling the story, but with a consistent emotional core that made the specific wording almost irrelevant. Scott was furious. And the name that came out of his mouth in that fury was the one name in that entire building that changes everything when it's attached to anger. Shohei Ohtani. What Scott said about Ohtani was not a tactical disagreement. It was not the professional frustration of a pitcher who believed a different game plan decision would have produced a different outcome. It was personal in the way that things become personal when a man has absorbed more than he can professionally contain and the pressure finally finds an exit. The specific words matter less than what they revealed. They revealed that underneath the surface of a clubhouse that had presented a unified face to the outside world, something had been building. Some version of a conversation that had never been allowed to happen in the open. Some accumulation of small moments and unspoken tensions and unanswered questions about what it means to be a teammate, to be a supporting character, in a story that has only ever had one protagonist. Scott's anger at Ohtani was not really about Ohtani. It was about everything that Ohtani represents in that building. The decisions that get made around him. The weight that the rest of the roster carries in service of making sure that his story ends the right way in October. The invisible pressure of playing on a team where the margin for everyone else's error is smaller because the standard set by one person is so impossibly, unfairly high. Scott had felt all of that. He had carried all of that. And in the worst moment of his professional year, it came out attached to a name. Mookie Betts heard what Scott said. He heard it the same way everyone in that clubhouse heard it, quickly, completely, with enough detail to understand exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. And then Mookie Betts did something that veteran players in professional locker rooms almost never do. He spoke publicly about his manager's decisions. Not in the vague, carefully worded way that athletes sometimes gesture toward disagreement without fully committing to it. Not with the kind of language that can be walked back in a follow-up conversation. Clearly. Directly. With the specific precision of a man who had decided that the professional cost of saying something honest was lower than the personal cost of staying silent. There are moments in a game where the decision in the dugout changes everything, Betts said. The 8th inning was one of those moments. And I don't think we made the right call. The reporter who had asked the question sat very still after those words landed. Because Mookie Betts had just said, on record, in plain language, that Dave Roberts had been wrong. Roberts heard about it before his press conference ended. Someone passed him a phone. He read the quote. He set the phone down on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment without picking it back up. When the next question came, his voice had changed slightly. Not broken. Not defensive. But different in a way that the reporters in that room, who had spent years learning to read the specific textures of his composure, noticed immediately. Mookie is one of the best players I've ever managed, Roberts said slowly. He sees the game at a level that very few people do. If he thinks we made the wrong call, I'm going to sit with that. A reporter pushed further. Does that mean you're reconsidering the decision to use Scott in the eighth? Roberts looked at the table again. The pause was long enough to count. It means I'm reconsidering everything, he said. That's what tonight requires. Somewhere in that stadium, Tanner Scott was alone with what he had said and what it was going to cost him. Sasaki was sitting with the weight of a role he hadn't asked for, handed to him in the aftermath of someone else's failure. Mookie Betts had said something that could not be unsaid. And the GM was in a room with his staff, surrounded by numbers and projections and the specific kind of organizational silence that descends when a decision has been made and everyone in the room knows the consequences of it haven't fully arrived yet. And Shohei Ohtani, whose name had been thrown into a moment of fury that had nothing and everything to do with him, was standing near his locker, completely still, in the particular way that he goes still when he is processing something that requires more than the usual amount of processing. The Dodgers had lost a lead in the eighth inning. Everything else that followed was the cost of that. And the cost, it turned out, was higher than anyone had priced it at when the night began.